It's a little confusing when you try to outline it. And so that's what I've done for you. I've outlined it. And I think what we'll do tonight is I'll read all the way through the chapter without pausing or commenting the first place. And it's difficult to tie together. Why is he saying this? He says something in the first paragraph, and then he makes some statements in the second, and you can't exactly see now how does he intend for us to connect those. And so I'll try to connect those if I understand what Lewis is trying to say once we get through reading the chapter from start to finish. Now, if you're not married, then that means you won't be involved in sexuality, but there is the other thing in this chapter which I really think is what he's talking about. It's the nature of love. What is the love that expresses itself in sexuality, and what is the love that should then produce marriage? What is the basis for marriage? He talks about always, quote, being in love, unquote. And of course, Lewis would say that's not a cause for ever marrying, is, quote, being in love, end of quote. Well then, he never really says here, I don't think anyway, except by implication. Well, what is the basis for marriage then? So if you're not married, he still gives other examples, such as the family, and you can think of the church, where there has to be a unity, in plurality. That is another one of the things he's trying to stress here. He's stressing it in the marriage relationship, he stresses it in the family, but the basic thing is the marriage relationship. So this unity is spoken of in under a metaphor in Scripture that's called one flesh. And so I'm going to be using, it might not be a word, but I'm going to use it anyway, the concept of one fleshness. I have to add the ness on there so we have the concept. One flesh is one thing. That's, something different than one fleshness. I need the concept. That's a metaphor in Scripture. The two will be one flesh. Well, we know you're not one flesh. You're two different blood types, perhaps, different people, different flesh, different bones. You're not one flesh. So it's a metaphor. And exactly what does he mean? I don't pretend to have all the answers. And I certainly wouldn't even try to get into them in just a study on Screwtape Letters. What is one fleshness in Scripture? But I think that he does approach some sublime topics here in marriage and in this concept of whatever he means by one fleshness. Because I don't think that any of us love as we should love. Remember our definition of love. Love is just absolutely self-sacrificial. And it loves because of its own being. I mean, God loves not because He sees anything that's worthy of His love in us or in anything. It's because of His own being that He chooses to love. And how far, far short we fall of that. How far short we fall of that. We still have these being in love, quote unquote, understandings and definitions of love. And if we got our theology right, I'm not convinced that any of us have our practice right. But that is not what love is all about. Love is something that, and so these ignorant people that think that you can have love and not be saved, or have love and not have the Holy Spirit, the situational ethics people say that, well, the basic criterion for all things is love. Well, the problem is you can't love. People don't have love. You're not going to know how to love until you know God. And even then, how far short we fall of the love that God expresses. His is what we would call a biblical love. And His isn't a good love because it's based on the Bible, but the Bible is based on Him. That's an expression of Himself. Well, my dear Wormwood, even under Slubgob, you must have learned at college the routine technique of sexual temptation. And since for us spirits this whole subject is one of considerable tedium, though necessary as part of our training, I will pass over it. But on the larger issues involved, I think you have a great deal to learn. The enemy's demand on humans takes the form of a dilemma. Either, or Lewis is from England, they pronounce the I and we in America pronounce the E, either complete abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. Ever since our fathers' first great victory, we have rendered the former very difficult to them. The latter, for the last few centuries, we have been closing up as a way of escape. We have done this through the poets and novelists by persuading the humans that a curious and usually short-lived, or short-lived to really pronounce it correctly, experience which they call being in love is the only respectable ground for marriage, that marriage can and ought to render this excitement permanent, and that a marriage which does not do so is no longer binding. This idea is our parody of an idea that came from the enemy. The whole philosophy of hell rests on the recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and especially that oneself is not another self. My good is my good, and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. Even an inanimate object is what it is by excluding all other objects from the space it occupies. If it expands, it does so by thrusting other objects aside or by absorbing them. A self does the same. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of a weaker self into a stronger. To be means to be in competition. Now, the enemy's philosophy is nothing more nor less than one continued attempt to evade this very obvious truth. He aims at a contradiction. Things are to be many, yet somehow also one. The good of oneself is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love. And this same monotonous panacea, a cure-all, can be detected under all he does and even all he is, or claims to be. Thus he is not content even himself to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. At the other end of the scale, he introduces into matter that obscene invention, the organism, in which the parts are perverted from their natural destiny of competition and made to cooperate. His real motive for fixing on sex as the method of reproduction among humans is only too apparent from the use he has made of it. Sex might have been, from our point of view, quite innocent. It might have been merely one more mode in which a stronger self preyed upon a weaker, as it is indeed among the spiders, where the bride concludes her nuptials by eating her groom. But in the humans, the enemy has gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desire. He has also made the offspring dependent on the parents and given the parents an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism, only worse. For the members are more distinct, yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love. Now comes the joke. The enemy described a married couple as one flesh. He did not say a happily married couple, or a couple who married because they were in love, but you can make the humans ignore that. You can also make them forget that the man they call Paul did not confine it to married couples. Mere copulation for him makes one flesh. You can thus get the humans to accept as rhetorical eulogies of being in love what were in fact plain descriptions of the real significance of sexual intercourse. The truth is that wherever a man lies with a woman, there, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. From the true statement that this transcendental relation was intended to produce, and if obediently entered into, too often will produce, affection in the family, humans can be made to infer the false belief that the blend of affection, fear, and desire, which they call being in love, is the only thing that makes marriage either happy or holy. The error is easy to produce because being in love does very often, in Western Europe, precede marriages, which are made in obedience to the enemy's designs, that is, with the intention of fidelity, fertility, and goodwill, just as religious emotion very often, but not always, attends conversion. In other words, the humans are to be encouraged to regard as the basis for marriage a highly colored and distorted version of something the enemy really promises as its result. Two advantages follow. In the first place, humans who have not the gift of continence can be deterred from seeking marriage as a solution because they do not find themselves in love. And, thanks to us, the idea of marrying with any other motive seems to them low and cynical. Yes, they think that. They regard the intention of loyalty to a partnership for mutual help, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life as something lower than a storm of emotion. Don't neglect to make your man think the marriage service very offensive. The second place, any sexual infatuation whatever, so long as it intends marriage, will be regarded as love, and love will be held to excuse a man for all the guilt and to protect him from all the consequences of marrying a heathen, a fool, or a wanton. But more of this in my next. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So we see that A, this chapter leads right into 19 then. And B, the earlier chapter led into this one. Remember this last sentence on page 79. But this whole business is too large to deal with at the tail end of a letter. And so he picks it up in the chapter that we're going to be discussing tonight. Now, did you get a lot out of that? Wasn't a lot of, well, what's the point of saying this? What's the connection between this paragraph and an earlier one? What does he really mean by what he's saying here? Well, I certainly see that in this chapter, that it's kind of disorganized. And so the best way to organize it is either to rearrange the paragraphs, and you probably have to write some of your own, to draw some sense out of it, or try to draw up some outline that will help you, or like hold your hand and walk with you step by step through the way to make sure you understand what he's trying to prove, because he leaves a lot of things for us to infer, but a lot of things unsaid. And that, I think, is what produces a little difficulty here. So let's go way back to the beginning. The first paragraph is just introduction, so I won't include that in my outline. And then I'll start giving you an outline, and I'll give it to you 1, A, B, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, D, so you can have it before you, and I think it'll help you in seeing the connection of some of Lewis's thoughts. He starts off by saying that surely his understudy has gone through some course in college on sexual temptation. Notice he said that since for us spirits this whole subject is one of considerable tedium, then I'll pass it over. So the chapter, in essence, does really not deal with sexual temptation. Sexuality is there, but it's related to other things. And why would we suppose that he says that it's of a considerable tedium to us as spirits? Well, as spirits, they don't have the type of physical desire or appetite or need that a human being would experience. That would be beyond their capabilities of experience. And so he said it's tedious for us because we've got to know the essence of what's going on without ever having experienced this before. So he said, you've already learned about that, at least in elementary class in college under Slubgob, so I'll pass over it now. The next paragraph gets us into our outline. So I would have down something like Roman numeral 1, the dilemma of sexuality. But I don't really think he's going to talk about sexuality. I think he's going to use that as a springboard. The dilemma of sexuality. Often what we mean by a dilemma is that you are between a rock and a hard place. Both the rock and the hard place are simply not an alternative. And so it leaves you nowhere. And so the rock is, this would be alternative 1 with the dilemma, you can opt for no sex at all. The hard place would be, this would be the alternative for that, the hard place would be you would opt for one partner for life. And then, you see, he's not saying enough here. You have to read ahead and pick it up and then come back and attach it. to what he said earlier. And then you might want to put out in parentheses, beside one partner for life, let's hope that your partnership is on the wrong basis. It has a wrong foundation. That's what the whole chapter is going to be developing there. But yet, that's not only it, because it's always drawing in some of these other things. Okay, the enemy's demand on humans takes the form of a dilemma. Here's the dilemma. Either complete abstinence, or unmitigated monogamy, lifelong monogamy. One man, one woman as a partnership for life, and no other flings outside of that. Well, let's look at these two. We've either got abstinence in the absolute sense, or monogamy in the unmitigated sense. Which of those two do you think is more difficult than the other? Well, he tells us here in the chapter, he tells us in the next sentence, as a matter of fact, and I think that we would know from human life and human experience. I think it's easier to get married and stay married, although, of course, we're seeing a breakdown there. It's easier to get married and stay married than to practice total or absolute abstinence. That is extremely difficult. Who really practices that? Oh, a few throwaway old maids here and there. But who really practices that, though? Who really can live, besides monks and nuns and other odd, strange people, who really can live their whole life with absolute abstinence? A lot of people, once they've gotten married, they said, well, I could have done without it. But look, it's after it's happened. It's too late to say that now. It's too late, because before you were just burning, which shows that your abstinence was not a lifelong thing. It would not have lasted. You were already burning to begin with. It's extremely difficult. And he goes on to tell us why. Ever since our Father's first great victory, we have rendered the former very difficult, which we'll get into that here in just a moment. But that is an extremely difficult thing to practice. Of course, today it's almost as though we're not under any obligation or any bondage to have to obey this law if we're not going to marry, of absolute abstinence, because there's nothing wrong with sex outside of marriage. But of course we know there's something dreadfully wrong with sex outside of marriage. And so if you're not married, you only have one choice. There's only one choice if you're not married. Of course, we could say there's two: get married, but we're assuming that you're not married, you don't want to get married. Or you're not married and there are no prospects for marriage. If you don't have that, there's only one choice. We need to hear this in American society. You don't have another choice. Amen. There's only one choice, so it's not a choice. It's a law. You know, a choice implies you got at least two things you can choose from. If marriage is already out for you for whatever reason, then there's only one path for you to follow. That's absolute abstinence. And we know from human life and human existence that is next to impossible to live or practice. For either, since we're speaking from the British point of view, for either men or women. That's almost impossible to practice. Now maybe after you've hit 70 years it becomes easier then. But it takes a while before it becomes easier. And we're going to be touching on this issue Sunday morning. That's why it's, again, appropriate that our studies will go together. There's no sense in fooling ourselves and saying, it's no big deal. Anyone can abstain from sex. It's no big deal. We're just fooling ourselves to say that. There's nothing wrong with dating for 9 or 10 years. Or being engaged for 9 or 10 years. We're fooling ourselves. We're really not, because we sin, and then we didn't fool anybody. We're wise. We know what's happened because it did happen. So there's no sense in other words, there's no sense in pretending something doesn't exist when it does. Just because this is an area that you're not supposed to talk about, then that almost implies to everyone else that it's something that doesn't even exist. It's no problem at all, just because we're not supposed to talk about it. Well, just because we're not, quote, supposed to talk about it, unquote, doesn't mean that we don't have a problem. In fact, we very much do have a problem. We can't say that which is, isn't. I mean, we're calling that which exists a non-existent thing. That doesn't make any sense at all. And then the next alternative we have, he said, is unmitigated monogamy. One partner for life. And so when you present the case to a person who's not married but who has the potential of being married, then in fact he does have two choices, or she does have two choices, and only two. And one of those is that you can have sex without marriage. That's not one of the options. You either have no sexual relations, or you have sexual relations only in marriage and only with one partner to whom you're married for life. That's called puritanical mores by the news media out there today. But that's the only way. As human beings, whether we live in Iran or the United States, whether it's before the cross or after the cross, whether we're black or white, rich or poor, whether we're male or female, whenever you're 18, 19, 20, 25, those are the two choices that you have before you for the rest of your life. Those are the two paths that you have. And there's no other path. You pick one or the other of those. And 99 and 9/10%, pick the path of married life. I mean, that's the path to go. Very few people are not married. I read of someone, who was that? Some famous person, I've forgotten now. I wish it would come back to me. One of the stars. Maybe you read it in the media recently. I don't even remember where I read it. But anyway, they had been living together for 9 years, and they finally decided to go ahead and get married. I thought, that is the oddest, weirdest thing. I mean, either, why didn't you get married back at the beginning, or why even get married now at all? You've gone 9 years, why not go 90 more? I mean, why right here? I mean, it'd either be at the very beginning marry, or just live together and don't ever get married. Or as you say, well, what we're doing is it's a practice marriage. We want to practice before we do it. 9 years of practice? Generally, it's like 2 or 3 or 4 years you live together and then you get married. But it was 9 years they had lived together and then finally decided to go ahead and get married. I just thought, for the life of me, that doesn't seem to make any sense. So here's Roman numeral 1, the dilemma of sexuality. Now, you're not beyond the dilemma, you see. You say, well, I've already made my choice. I've chosen one partner for life, unmitigated monogamy. Well, that's true. You've made your choice, but that doesn't mean that there aren't temptations still around, though. That doesn't mean temptations can't still creep in. So let's don't fool ourselves again here and think, well, I've made my choice. I'm never going to get married. That's easy to say until you meet that beautiful man or that beautiful woman. It's easy to say, I won't ever be tempted because everyone that I've ever met's ugly anyway. And so I won't have any problem with total abstinence or absolute abstinence. Well, that's easy to say. It's another thing to live. And the same is true, but not nearly so strongly, with the other position. So I've chosen one partner for life. Well, there's always the alternative for a lot of people of divorce. So you can have 2 or 3 or 4 partners, none of them for life. You see, just because you're married doesn't mean you're going to always be married. A lot of people aren't. They marry and divorce and marry and divorce. Or you could stay married your whole life and yet still fall into sexual sin outside of marriage. So, dilemma. There is a dilemma. Sexuality is a dilemma. You get your pick of which of those paths you want to follow. And just because you've chosen that path doesn't mean that you're safe. So he said the enemy's demand on humans takes the form of a dilemma. It is a dilemma. I guess some people would say that's unfair, God. You've made us sexual creatures. We do have those desires. And then you've given us 2 paths, but both of the paths have pitfalls, though. There are holes in the road down there. Well, that's what heaven is like. You see, once you get to heaven, you'll be on a path that doesn't have any holes. But down here, you've got the good life. You can choose the right way, the biblical thought, and the biblical way to live, and then still you have temptation. All right, Roman numeral 2. He goes into the history of Satan's work regarding the dilemma. The history of Satan's work regarding the dilemma. The no sex or one partner for life dilemma. Then we would have A. That's our first part of Satan's history. He has rendered absolute abstinence well nigh impossible to perform. That's the history of Satan's work regarding sin and sexuality. In other words, living as an unmarried person and living purely sexually is well nigh impossible. And he said, we've rendered it this way ever since our Father's first great victory. Ever since our Father's first great victory. So I think that what he's saying here is because of the fallen nature of man. The first great victory doesn't necessarily have anything to do with sexuality, but what it produced was a fallen nature. And so ever since the first great victory, we have a man with fallen nature. And he's always going to have a problem then whenever it comes to being unmarried and sexuality. And then B, he said that in recent years, the one partner for life theory has run on rough times. I mean, the no-sex theory is well nigh impossible. We would agree with that. It's much more difficult to live that type of life. Recent years, he says, the one partner for life theories run on some rough rocks. And then we could ask ourselves with regard to the second one, why? We already answered why for the first one. Why is the celibate life well nigh impossible? Because of man's fallen nature. Why is the one partner for life theory becoming more difficult? Because through popular writings, we humans have been misguided in our understanding of love. We've been misguided through the poets and novelists, through popular writings. We've been misguided in our understanding of love. I was never taught any of these things as I was growing up. You know, it was never even emphasized to me, I suppose because my parents just took it for granted. But they never hammered home this business of you've got two paths you can choose. That was never hammered home. You either can not marry, and you'll have to somehow keep yourself pure, and that's impossible to do, leaving just a little fraction of an inch there for the few who can do it. So what you're going to end up doing is you're going to marry. And that was never hammered home. And then what is marriage? And what is the basis for marriage? Never heard a thing about it. Never learned about it. I mean, what you can get from reading the Bible, and you can learn a lot on your own reading the Bible, but I didn't have any good, regular, systematic teaching. There's just something about it when someone comes and tells you something. It's one thing whenever you read it in the Bible, but you always have ways of getting out of it, or not understanding it, or not thinking it's important, or just not seeing it's important until someone comes and says, this is important. Marriage is important. So we got married, probably like a lot of people do, without a really good understanding of what marriage is all about. No counseling, no advice, no suggestions. It's just kind of like, well, once you grow up, you know, like two raccoons, once they grow up, they just go off and get married, you know, in the sense that raccoons get married. It's like it's just a natural thing. As you grow up, you go and do it. And I guess with raccoons, you don't need a lot of instruction on what the married life is all about. They've already learned how to hunt and fish and so forth, just watching mommy and daddy. But whenever it comes to humans, yeah, you've learned a lot about marriage by watching mommy and daddy too. What not to do whenever you're married. But you can't put your finger on anything. You don't know anything. And so it's the old abominable situation that we call trial and error. Amen. That why can't someone who is married and who knows what the Bible teaches about these deep matters come and tell us about marriage, so that whenever we get into it on the right foot. We just don't have anyone that'll do that. Even people who are married sometimes don't know much about marriage at all. They're not mature, and if they know something about marriage and they can tell you a few things about communication and about burning toast and things, they still don't know the biblical message of it. They don't really know what biblical love is all about. So it's kind of the old trial and error, and then look back in the past and look at your mistakes, and then learn more about the Word of God, and then try to get it all corrected. And by then, even two wanton, what does he call them over here? Two heathen, fools, wontons could have a good married life by then. You've been at it so long. Trial and error, and you've tried and erred many times, and now you finally perfected the whole thing. And you're going to have that in marriage, even though you have the world's greatest married couple come and teaching a marriage seminar to you. You're still going to go through your own trial and error. But a lot of that's unnecessary wouldn't be there. Because someone would have exposed all of that. And of course, I don't think that you can get it in a marriage seminar somewhere for 3 nights or 4 days or something. I think that it ties into what we're doing here, a full study of all things about God in the Bible. That's the only way you're really going to learn what's going on. That's why I think that we've seen improvements in marriages around here because of, we certainly haven't studied about marriage a lot, but studied about a lot of things. And you can just hear what the Spirit is saying. There's this death of self business. There's this love, this one fleshness concept that comes through in many different connections. So let's read the material now that goes with this Roman numeral 2, a history of Satan's work regarding the dilemma. Ever since our fathers' first great victory, we have rendered the former very difficult to them. No sex. The latter, marriage, one partner, unmitigated monogamy. The latter, for the last few centuries, we have been closing up as a way of escape. And think how that way of escape has been closed up since Lewis wrote this book. We have been closing up as a way of escape. And think how that way of escape has been closed up since Lewis wrote this book in the 1960s and 1970s. You think in the last centuries it was closed up. Come on, that was the good old days then. It's been in the last 20 years that this way has just about been closed up for everyone as an escape. So what are you going to do then? If marriage won't work and if abstinence won't work, that's what I mean. It's a dilemma. You're between a rock and a hard place. What are you going to do then? We have done this, speaking of the latter one, we have done this through the poets and novelists. Thank God for these visionary mystics that write well, but it won't work though. Sounds good of, your hair is the color of this, and whenever you get married to her and you see her in the morning and all that, you know that story. I mean, the poets have really confused people. They've really misguided us. A Romeo and Juliet thing is really very misguiding. Oh, if I were the glove upon thy hand. That's beautiful metaphor, beautiful poetry. But I don't think that we're taught to read that just as poetry. This is poetry. This is make-believe. That this is not really the way that it is. Or if it is, it's only the way that it is for a short period of time. As he says here, short life. So we have done this through the poets and novelists by persuading the humans. He's going to go through a step 1, 2, 3 here. That a curious and usually short-lived experience, which they call being in love, is the only respectable ground for marriage. Okay, here's step 1. Why should we get married? What's the basis for marriage? Being in love. But notice it's in quotation marks. We're going to say something else about, what is the basis for marriage then? It's being in love. Let's remember it as he describes it, a curious and usually short-lived experience called being in love. But that's the basis for marriage. Alright, that's step 1. That marriage can, it has the ability to, and it should, it ought to, render this excitement permanent. In other words, that being in love causes you to get married. So being in love produces marriage. Now in return, marriage is going to do something for being in love. Marriage is going to render being in love, quote unquote, permanent. And then step 3 here, and that a marriage which does not do so is no longer binding. That spells divorce then. That you can be in love, quote unquote, marry. Your marriage never renders the being in love permanent. Therefore, that marriage is not a true marriage. That marriage is no longer binding. It would be a true marriage and binding up to the point of the conclusion of, quote, being in love, unquote. As soon as being in love stops, then the marriage is no longer binding, that you could divorce. See, he never mentions the word divorce here, but that's obviously what's being said. So he's saying, what I'm saying here is, we've got the history of Satan's work regarding this dilemma. And let me give you the why for this second part here again, because through popular writings we humans have been misguided in our understanding of love. See, he's saying something else as well as that, but I think that's the basic thing that he's saying. That we've been misguided in our understanding of love. Okay, Roman numeral 3. It's difficult to give a title to this because he's going back and forth between love, marriage, one-fleshness. You see, those things are different. They're different concepts that come to one's mind when those three different words are spoken. But I will entitle Roman numeral 3, On the Nature of Love. On the Nature of Love. I'm just giving you this outline to help make sense of the chapter. On the nature of love. Then, large letter A. What love can't be, according to the definition of hell. What it can't be according to hell. That will take care of the next paragraph. So let's read this paragraph. This is what love can't be. The whole philosophy of hell rests on recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and especially that one self is not another self. Now you may want to put a little star by this, because this little phrase, one thing is not another thing, that's the first law in classical logic, I guess I would say. And we're going to use this, we're going to come across this again in a few months from now in Christian ethics on worldviews and worldliness. It's the first law of classical logic. One thing is not another thing. And I'll explain what I mean by that whenever we get there. The breakdown in three philosophical assumptions that philosophers have held up until this century, the 20th century. They surrendered those three assumptions. It's been held throughout history. Three assumptions, the three great assumptions of philosophy. And now those are no longer held. None of the three are held anymore. And that's why we see some of the confusion, all the confusion that we see. But you may want to note this, that you're going to hear me make reference to the first law of classical logic. I talked about debating here recently, that a debate can only be a debate when you get two people together who will agree on the rules of the game. If they don't agree on a foundation of truth, if they don't agree on the definitions, if they don't agree on the terms that are used, if you don't agree on the rules of the game, then you can't talk. You're calling blue black, and I'm calling blue gold. And so I can just insist all day long my point about blue being gold, and it never registers on you, because blue is black to you. It's not blue, and it's not blue to me, it's gold. So I keep saying, well, if what I'm saying is true, then this will have to be true. And that might be true if what I'm saying is true, but what I'm saying is not true. Blue isn't gold. And you're saying, well, if blue is black, then this proves this point. Well, I disagree that blue is black. So we can never talk then. We can't talk meaningfully. And so there are ways, and people don't even allow it to be practiced anymore, but it did. People did at one time. It was called logic. You studied in school, rhetoric and logic, and there are rules. There are rules to the game, like rules to any sport or something. Maneuvers that you use in chess, not necessarily, well, there are rules to chess, but there are maneuvers that you use in chess. And if you don't play either by the rules and or the maneuvers, you lose. If you don't play by the rules, you're disqualified. Your king can't just go every which way over one step, over one square. You're disqualified. If you don't practice the right maneuvers, you'll lose the game. No one will disqualify you. Someone will beat your pants off of you. So the same thing is true with just talking about anything under the sun, including the sun. If we don't practice the rules of the game in the discussion, then talk is not meaningful anymore. And I think that this is the basic rule of talking about anything, that one thing is not another thing. If it is, then it's not the first thing. We can't talk about it meaningfully then. So we'll come back to that later in logic. But this is something I practice all the time, and that's why I can teach and think clearly. One thing is not another thing. A lot of people want to make this view kind of a combination of this, that, or the other. Well, it's either this or that. One thing is not another thing. It's either black or white. And if people won't reason and talk with you like that, then you can't discuss things. They have to go their way, calling black and white kind of pinkish purple. And you still say black is black and white is white. And especially that one self is not another self. Remember what we're talking about on the nature of love. This is what it's not according to him. My good is my good, and your good is yours. In other words, we can't share. What one gains, another loses. Even an inanimate object is what it is by excluding all other objects from the space it occupies. See, where he's headed is to talk about this concept of one fleshness. That's where he's going. That's why he's trying to differentiate. I mean, if the pulpit occupies this space, it can't be one flesh with our piano. And as soon as the piano moves over here to become one flesh with the pulpit, what does it do? It pushes the pulpit over there. One thing is not another thing. You see, that's what he's trying to say. So what he's going to rule out here, the demon's going to rule out in the future, is this one fleshness and love business. There's no such thing. Because as soon as you got two people, to be means to compete. I think that's what he ends this paragraph with. To be means to be in competition. As soon as you got person A and person B, as soon as you got two things, then to be, existence means competition, not oneness. That's ruled out by the first law of logic. See, this is a very deep chapter right here. It's difficult to follow. A self does the same. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, see, he says, now that's a little different than two physical objects, one moving the other. The animal, but still the animal doesn't become one flesh with the thing that he eats. You know, he subdues, he devours, he conquers, he rules over. You don't have perfect unity in diversity. There is diversity, and then there becomes unity, but you don't even have distinctness anymore. Somehow, once we get the oneness, we have to also keep the two-ness. And whenever you eat, you don't have that. You have two-ness, and it becomes oneness, and then it's only oneness. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of a weaker self into a stronger. To be means to be in competition. Remember, this is hell's definition here, so we would disagree with it. But we're saying that it's got a lot of good logic behind it, though. It's got, in one sense, the first law of classical logic behind it. But the scriptures are higher than the first law of classical logic does. But if all of that is true and nothing else is true besides this, then what hell is saying has to be right. To be is competition. In other words, as soon as there is you and myself, as soon as we exist, there's no way we can be together. To be always has to spell competition, because one thing cannot be the other thing. See, as long as we will grant the first assumption that he gives us here, the axiom that one thing is not another, then everything else that he says here is true. As long as we can grant that one is not another, that I can't be you and you can't be me. And so what else exists but that we're against each other, competition? All right, then B, under Roman numeral 3. The mystery of unity and distinctness. The mystery of unity and distinctness. Then number 1 under that, examples. And then A, B, and C under examples, he gives us 3. Let's read that section, and then I'll give you a number 2. Example. First of all, in general. I'll tell you when we get to the first one, which will be A. Now, the enemy's philosophy is nothing more nor less than one continued attempt to evade this very obvious truth. He aims at a contradiction. In other words, a contradiction of one thing is another thing, and yet it's not. Things are to be many, yet somehow also one. That defies the first law of logic. A is not B. the good of oneself is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love. And this same monotonous panacea can be detected under all he does and even all he is or claims to be. Next he goes into our first example of the Trinity, the mystery of unity and distinctness. Thus he is not content even himself to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. There's the first example, the Trinity. Then he says, for example 2, way at the other end of the scale, way up high here is the Trinity. Way at the other end of the scale is every organism, from a beetle bug to a human being. An organism, all organisms. The other end of the scale he introduces into matter that obscene invention, the organism, in which the parts are perverted from their natural destiny of competition and made to cooperate. Take your own body. You've got all the various distinct parts in your own body, and yet they're not competing with each other. They are working together. He's saying there's another example of this business that the enemy is trying to bring in here. First of all, he's got his own self, the Trinity, and now this perverse creation of his, this obscene invention, the organism, where you've got many different parts, but yet there's unity in the diversity. Then the next paragraph gives us our third example, the family. His real motive for fixing on sex as a method of reproduction among humans is only too apparent from the use he has made of it. Sex might have been, from our point of view, quite innocent. It might have been merely one more mode in which a stronger self preyed upon a weaker, as it is indeed among the spiders, where the bride concludes her nuptials by eating her groom. But, so there one is subduing another. There you don't have unity. But in the humans, the enemy has gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desire. He has also made the offspring dependent on the parent, and given the parent an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism. See, here's our third example. It's like the organism, only worse. For the members are more distinct. You see, at least in your body, all the members are in one body and they're all together. When it comes to you and myself, we're totally distinct from each other. Only worse, for the members are more distinct, yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way, which then would make their unity of a higher order, because you have to will the unity. With your body, it's just natural. You've got many diverse parts that all work together. Whenever we as a church all work together, that's a greater, higher, deeper, more spiritual unity than what you have in your own body. Because here it's conscious, here it's something that you will into existence, here you're responsible for it, here we're dealing with entities that are more distinct than the members of an organism. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love. Then number 2, under B, we might call something like sexuality in marriage. Sexuality in marriage. And A under this, the outline probably won't end up perfect because he doesn't give me enough material to make it perfect. But A under this would be one fleshness. One fleshness. And then 1 under that would be its absoluteness. And then A under that, I got to give you all this before we can start reading. A under that, we're speaking of its absoluteness. A would be all married couples. B would be unmarried couples as well. So here's what we have. 2, sexuality in marriage. A, 1, fleshness. 1, its absoluteness. A, it's absoluteness in regard to all married couples, and B, in regard to unmarried couples. Now let's start reading. Now comes the joke. The enemy described a married couple as one flesh. Genesis 2, other places, Ephesians 5. He did not say a happily married couple. Now here's where he starts taking us deeper again. Or a couple who married because they were in love. He simply says if you are married, he describes that married couple as one flesh. What would the implication be? Marriage is permanent, which is what he was talking about back in the second paragraph on the first page that we looked at here. Marriage is permanent. Because look, if he's saying that marriage, I don't care whether you got married for the right reason, the wrong reason, in love, out of love, in hate, out of hate, happily married, sad that you're married, if you are married, the fact of the matter is God describes that marriage as one flesh, whether you like the one flesh or not, whether you like your marriage or not. Now, if he describes it as one flesh, what would we infer from that? That divorce is not allowed then. And in other words, he describes it as one flesh, not because you're enjoying your marriage, but because you're married. See, if he was describing it as one flesh because you enjoy it, then if you stop enjoying your marriage, a lot of people believe this, you see. Amen. Then that means you don't have a true marriage anymore, and divorce is just a functional thing then. It has no moral connotations to it one way or the other. People who believe in divorce wouldn't be able to explain it the way Lewis is here, but that's essentially their philosophy, though. He's saying it's not because you're happy in your marriage that God says, all right, I'm going to call that one flesh. He says you're married, that means it's one flesh. And so that would imply that marriage is permanent. Then he goes on and makes a second point, though. He said that this one fleshness, its absoluteness, is so absolute that it applies even with unmarried people. You can also make them forget that the man they call Paul did not confine it to married couples. This one fleshness, that he didn't confine it to married couples. Mere copulation for him makes one flesh. Let's see if I need to read on. This is the most complicated section here. I think I'll read on. You can thus get the humans to accept as rhetorical eulogies of being in love what were in fact plain descriptions of the real significance of sexual intercourse. I think I'll stop there. Now in 1 Corinthians 6:16, quoting the NIV, do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute, well obviously no marriage is taking place there, is one with her in body, for it is said, the two will become one flesh. That's what he has reference to. He says that man they call Paul said that it's one flesh even when they're not married. If they have sexual relations with each other, it's one flesh then. And I think he has reference to 1 Corinthians 6:16. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. So he's saying, now he's back to sexuality. That sexuality is so important that it can even make a connection. He goes on to describe this transcendental relation. It even makes that whenever you're not married. I mean, what is it about marriage that all of a sudden makes sex sex? It's sex whether you're married or not married. The same type of emotions and feelings and so forth are in it, are present whether you're married or not married. Marriage is what sanctifies it. But you can have it and have the one fleshness, the one flesh concept, and not be married. That's what he's arguing for here. Now let's give the implication of the second point here. Its absoluteness as far as the unmarried are concerned. Here's the implication. It's a little difficult to draw this out, what he's saying here. Thus, since God's will is that male, female, one fleshness be solely saved from marriage, then A, sex outside this bond is immoral. And B, I'll go back over it, normally if sex occurs outside of this bond, marriage should follow. Let me say that again. Thus, since God, here's what he's implying by saying that even if you're unmarried and you have sexual relations, you've entered into a one-flesh relationship. Even if you're not married, you enter into a one-flesh relationship. And here's what we would infer. Thus, since God's will is that male, female, one-fleshness be solely saved for marriage, he doesn't deny that it can happen outside of marriage. We just quoted 1 Corinthians 6:16. He doesn't deny that it can happen outside. What is his will, though? His will is that the one-fleshness be saved for marriage. It's a metaphor, and I think it includes more than sexuality, but that has to be at the heart of it as well. Or it wouldn't use that metaphor, it would use some other metaphor. Thus, since God's will is that male, female, one-fleshness be solely saved for marriage, sex outside this bond is immoral. You can do it outside of marriage and thereby enter into a one-flesh relationship, but it's immoral because it's not sanctified with marriage. Sex outside this bond is immoral. And B, that normally, generally speaking, marriage should follow sex outside of marriage. In the Old Testament, there was a law about that, and it wasn't an absolute law that if a young man and young woman had relations prior to marriage that they had to get married, but that was a generally accepted and expected thing, though. There were cases where that was not absolutely required, where the man could pay a fine to the woman's father and not end up marrying her. And so here's where I don't want to go off too far, because this is a broad subject. All right, what happens then? If they have entered into a one-flesh relationship, if that's how we interpret 1 Corinthians 6:16, that one-fleshness can occur prior to marriage if there's sexual relations, then what happens if they don't end up marrying, they end up marrying someone else? Is that like divorce and remarriage then? See, that's a complicated issue right there. What if they've had sex before marriage and they've already entered into one flesh relationship? They don't have marriage to sanctify it, but whether it's sanctified or not, whether it's holy or not, it still happens. And they're still one flesh. And then they go and marry other people. Or don't get married. Then really, are they married the rest of their life, even though they're not married? He doesn't get into that here. It's one of those broad, big issues in marriage and sexuality. And then let's go on to 2. I've got to finish up real quickly here. The 2. First of all, 1 was its absoluteness. 2, absence of the significance of one-fleshness in marriage. The absence of the significance of one-fleshness in marriage. The truth is that wherever a man lies with a woman, there, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them, which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. From the true statement that this transcendental relation was intended to produce, and he said sometimes it will produce this. And what is that statement? That this relationship is intended to produce affection and family. Humans can be made to infer the false belief that the blend of affection, fear, and desire, which they call being in love, is the only thing that makes marriage either happy or holy. The error is easy to produce because being in love does very often in Western Europe precede marriages. These marriages are made in obedience to the enemy's designs, that is, with the intention of fidelity and fertility and goodwill. Just as religious emotion very often, but not always, attends conversion. In other words, if you missed all of that, here's what he's saying. In other words, the humans are to be encouraged to regard as the basis for marriage a highly colored and distorted version of something that the enemy really promises as its result. In other words, in the marriage relationship and in your expectations of everything, you've got, as they say, the cart before the horse. What you think, he said, this is what we produced here through all of this confusion that we've read here. What we have here is humans marrying on the wrong basis. And what is that basis? Quote, being in love. As he's described it earlier here, this curious short-lived experience that is filled with emotion. He calls it a storm of emotion over on page 84. That's the basis for marriage, is when you, quote, fall in love. You're being in love with someone. That's the basis for marriage. And he said, no, really. He said, they've got the cart before the horse. That's not how marriage starts off, quote, being in love. Notice what he said? Distorted version of something the enemy really promises as its result. Oh, what he's saying is, that should be the end, the result, the conclusion to a good marriage is, quote, being in love. That's not a proper foundation for marriage, because it's such a flexible thing. It's so shady. It's so dependent on so many other things. That's not a proper basis for love. And so what would we say is the proper basis for marriage? Well, love is the proper basis for marriage, but not his being in love. And I think that's what Lewis intends for us to make sure that is clear in our mind and that we understand. Love, as described at the bottom of this page, partnership for mutual help, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life. In other words, marriage as a commitment, that has to be the basis for marriage. Not any special way of feeling, not sexuality for sure, because that can produce one fleshness in or outside of marriage. So for sure not sexuality. It can keep you chaste in the rest of your life, for the rest of your life. It can do that. But just because you're attracted to just one person, that's not a basis for marrying them, because after you marry them, you may be attracted to someone else after them. So that wouldn't work. But truly love would be the basis for marriage. Love, as we've defined it in our studies in Christian ethics before, made up of those three characteristics, which I would briefly simply sum up tonight as commitment. That there is something you like about the person. You didn't just say, well, I'm going to spin a wheel and pick anyone in the world and then say, I'm going to commit myself to you. There is some type of attraction to the person. But it's not being in love attraction. It's the attraction where you go into the whole matter with your mind clear and your eyes wide open. And you say, I desire to make commitment in this.